Hi everyone, it's Jen again. I already recorded a half an hour video and then I realized that my microphone wasn't on, so here I go again. We are getting into the final stretch of OtomeJam, and I don't have a whole lot new on the development front as right now I am fine-tuning. I am playtesting. I'm trying to get other people to playtest so that I can go in and fix bugs, fix spelling and grammatical errors, and just kind of like add little quality of life features that are suggested to me from players that I might have overlooked, and try to make things a little bit more clear to what I'm trying to convey based on player feedback. There's still a few little assets in the work, but most of the writing and assets are finalized for what will be like the first 2/3 of the game. And then I'm still planning on finishing the last third of the game in the next 2 months of summer. And I figured that that last third will take me just as long, if not longer, than the first 2/3, because after my work on Soul Union, I realized that final stretch really is like way harder than any other part of the game development process. Even if you know, have created all the functions that you need and all the assets that you need, just trying to bring that story or that experience to a cohesive and satisfying closure is like so difficult. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that challenge. And the one thing that I did think about discussing this week, because I sort of debated whether or not I wanted to make a video at all, I didn't really know if I had anything to say, was I thought this might be a good idea, a good time to have a conversation about self-insert protagonists versus well-established protagonists. So I know that is something that kind of comes up in visual novel discussions, especially. My first visual novel, Soul Union, was a very well-established protagonist. He had a very defined personality, and the player choices that they had all were still within that parameter of his established personality. So you could make decisions that would skew him towards being more proactive, more assertive in the power path, or you could make choices that would make him more empathetic and lean more on his companions and trust in them more, or you could have him take the path of logic where he would be more pragmatic in his assessments of his situation and how he would resolve them. So none of those choices would skew him so hard that he would stop being like a guarded person, a analytical person. Like, that was just still a core part of his personality. And from a writing standpoint, it was what I was most comfortable with, because I come from a comics background. I'm used to having like a strong protagonist to drive the plot in my writing. When I decided to make Arcane Dice Wars, I've built the story around the player character being a self-insert. So at no point is the player character given an established personality or given any type of like default generic artwork to represent them. I don't like the idea of having like the generic protagonist artwork to represent something that's supposed to be a self-insert, because that is kind of implying that there is like a set normal or average or default to like the human presentation, which I don't think there should be, because of our just intrinsic nature as social creatures to want to try to conform to like a normal or set standard if society like presents one. This creates a lot of like narrative problems for me, because my games are heavily focused on building relationships with the characters in the story. And one of my problems with self-insert type stories in games is that I never feel like the self-insert character has a lot of agency, that they never really feel like the protagonist to me. They're just like getting kind of pulled in XYZ direction, and the protagonist just kind of switches from whichever character is their character arc in that moment. And I wouldn't say that I dislike passive characters in stories, or passive protagonists, but if it's not even an established part of their personality that they're passive, like, it's just I have a hard time inserting myself personally into stories. And so in the past, they've never really appealed to me. As I've started getting more into the whole isekai genre, I've come to appreciate that form of storytelling, of like wanting to give the reader a place to escape to, and I've come to appreciate the value of having more of a self-insert kind of story. But for me to tell that story, I wanted to like make it make sense in my head to capitalize on the advantages of having a self-insert type protagonist, instead of like my brain naturally want to wander to the cons of it from a storytelling perspective. So that was sort of like the whole purpose of Arcane Dice Wars, was that I was going to have the protagonist be from a different world than the rest of the cast, and that would kind of be one of the reasons why they're sort of being dragged around and they don't have a lot of like agency to drive the plot by themselves, because they're out of their element. And the other way that I was going to make this sort of work in my mind was that the world that they live in is a world where everybody is born of a certain element, so they have these like intrinsic traits to them that they cannot change. And then they are also beholden to certain gods, and so their path in life is pretty much set. They don't have any of their own agency other than to kind of just act out the story that's laid out in front of them. So they do have things like prophets and people who can actually like see the future with almost certainty, because that's how set in stone like the events of their world are meant to take place. Now that the protagonist has come into their world, this is a person who doesn't necessarily have anything powerful that they bring to the table. They can't use magic or fight the way that like at the level of any of the other characters in the story can, but they have no element and they are not beholden to the gods. They do not have a fate that has been set out for them, and because of this, the other player characters become immediately very drawn to the protagonist, and that they represent this idea of free will and agency that is completely foreign to them. And so they basically end up projecting like their deepest desires and wants upon the protagonist. So it doesn't become such a crippling problem in writing that the protagonist doesn't have established personality, because the protagonist basically ends up meaning something different to each one of the characters, that they are being placed on a pedestal and just having whatever like that protagonist, that character wants of the protagonist projected upon them. So it's really the protagonist being another vessel for storytelling, for like kind of bringing out these sort of like hidden desires, allowing the characters, the real protagonists of the story, to kind of like discover themselves, because the protagonist becomes a reflection of themselves to them. So it's sort of what would normally be considered like a wish fulfillment kind of story with like self-insert type material is usually considered to be like player wish fulfillment. I've sort of subverting that by making it the characters in the story's wish fulfillment, like the protagonist will serve as wish fulfillment for them. And I'll see how well my execution goes with that, but that is sort of like my whole purpose in like making this game. And I always have kind of like a strong core idea that I'm trying to subvert whenever I'm like writing a story. Again, I don't know how successful these ideas are in my execution, but I think it's important to like have that type of like core idea that you're trying to convey to focus your project around as a creator. And then the one other thought that I had sort of like just ruminating in my head over this past week that was sort of related to game development is, especially now that like the people are sort of feeling the crunch of jam time, is the idea that like game development, or especially solo development, is hard. And this is where I'm gonna get like kind of like picky with words, because I know that people aren't really like, we're using hard as like a general term, like it's challenging, you know, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of time, it's a lot of commitment, it's it can be sort of a slog at times, it can be lonely, you know, all these things are kind of like encapsulated in the word hard. But like in my own life, when I think about like what is hard for me, it's the non-game dev stuff. Like it's the stuff that I'm actually obligated to. It's you know, the things that I have to do to provide for my family and for myself. And you know, game development is just a way of like, you know, having fun playing, and I think I've sort of touched upon that in some of my other videos. And I just sort of want to reiterate that there's really nothing intrinsically special or unique about like doing something as a solo developer or as a solo anything in life, because we are all part of a community. So even if I am creating the game assets by myself, I'm not creating it in a bubble. I live in a society where there are other people who are like making things happen that allow me to do what I'm doing, whether that be like having power to my house, having food in my fridge, having clothes on my body, having running water to drink and bathe. And one could argue, well, they're getting paid to do that. But just because somebody is getting paid to do a service or to provide for their community, it doesn't mean that you are just entitled to them, to their services, to be taken for nothing, you know, like as if that wasn't actually labor. That's probably pretty hard. Like even very simple tasks are hard when you don't feel like doing them. Right? When you're obligated to do them, when you're on a timeline, you know, there's always going to be stress and hardships that are associated with that. And you're never going to be properly compensated for what it is you're doing, because if you were, then companies would no longer be profitable. You know, if you were actually getting compensated for what your time and effort are actually worth, there would be no profit margins to go to shareholders, etc. So, yeah, I just want to say to like not lose sight of that, because it's really easy to lose sight of that when you are like in working in your basement, not leaving your house for days on end, you know, pouring your heart and soul into something, putting lots of effort into something. Sometimes you can lose sight of like being part of like a broader community. Sometimes you can start feeling isolated and jaded and cynical. And I would just encourage everyone to take a step back from that and remember, you know, that we are all in this together. 99.9% of us are all in this together, and we're all doing things for each other that we don't even know. We don't know everybody's name of like the lives that we've touched with the services and things that we do to contribute to our community and to being part of this whole human experience. So please don't lose sight of that, and I hope that doesn't come across as like preachy. I'm not trying to guilt anybody. I genuinely believe that if you can keep this in mind, that it'll make you a happier person, because I just firmly believe that that is core to the human experience, is sharing that experience with others, whether they know who you are or not. We are a part of this together. And so I hope that that whenever you're feeling like you're in a tough spot, you know, not that other people have it worse than you, but that you're not alone. You're never alone. There's always other people around that are having a hand in your daily life that you might not even be aware of. All right. Take care. Don't forget to enjoy the process. And for all you dads out there, have a happy Father's Day. Bye.